The village is already lost when the young lieutenant makes his last decision. It is the day after Christmas, 1944, in northern Italy. German troops are pouring through the streets, overrunning a company of American soldiers and Italian partisans. On the second floor of a stone house, a forward artillery observer named John Fox watches them come, field glasses in one hand, telephone in the other. He has called for defensive fire all morning, walking the artillery closer and closer to his own position as the enemy closes in. Now the Germans are in the same building. The artillery officer on the other end of the line begs him to adjust the fire somewhere else. Fox looks out at the streets filled with gray uniforms, does the math on how long his friends need to escape, and says, "Fire it." Minutes later, when they find his body, it will be surrounded by roughly 100 dead Germans. Before we go to that house in Colonia, it helps to separate two stories that often get tangled online. Staff Sergeant Thomas Edward McCall was a white farm boy from Petersburg, Indiana. He earned the Medal of Honor on January 22, 1944, leading a machine gun section of Company F, 143rd Infantry Regiment, 36th Infantry Division across the Gari, often called Rapido, River near San Angelo, Italy. Under intense German mortar, artillery, and machine gun fire, he crossed an ice-covered bridge, reorganized shattered squads, personally sighted both of his machine guns, and then watched his gunners fall one by one. Alone, he hoisted a gun onto his hip, ran forward across open ground to within 30 yards of a German nest, and killed or wounded the entire crew. When a second gun opened up, he rushed that position too, firing from the hip and killing 4 of the crew. He was last seen advancing on a third gun, still firing, before German troops knocked him down and took him prisoner. McCall did not call artillery on himself. He fought with a machine gun until he was captured, then survived a German POW camp, was liberated, and later fought again in Korea. The man who actually ordered artillery fire on his own position, knowing he would die in the barrage, was First Lieutenant John Robert Fox of the segregated 92nd Infantry Division, the Buffalo Soldiers. His action came a year later, in a different Italian valley against a different German offensive. What follows is the story your title is really pointing at. Fox on the radio, still calling fire when the enemy is on his doorstep. Colonia was a medieval stone village in the Serchio River Valley of northern Italy, about 60 miles northwest of Florence. In December 1944, it was defended by a handful of Black American soldiers of the 92nd Infantry Division, about 70 men from the 366th Infantry Regiment, and 25 Italian partisans. They were new to combat in Italy. The Germans were not. On December 23rd, Fox volunteered to go forward to the village as an artillery observer for the 598th Field Artillery Battalion. His job was simple on paper and lethal in practice. Get to high ground, watch the enemy, and call in precise fire missions from miles away American guns. The mission was supposed to last 4 days. Nobody told Fox that the Germans were planning a Christmas attack, Operation Wintergewitter, Winter Storm, designed specifically to smash the inexperienced 92nd. By December 26th, the Germans had begun a relentless series of mortar and artillery barrages on Colonia. Fox and the defenders took cover in stone houses, listening to shells walk through the village. The Germans were methodical. First they shelled the approaches to the town, then the town itself. Then they came in person. At about 8 in the morning on December 26th, Fox looked through his window and saw German infantry moving into the streets. More kept coming. They were attacking in strength, supported by mortars and machine guns. The order to the 92nd had been to hold the village at all costs. That was easy to say from a headquarters miles away. On the ground, the reality was simple. There were too many Germans and not enough defenders. Fox began calling in defensive artillery fire to slow the advance. He gave grid coordinates, adjusted the fall of the shells, and walked the explosions closer and closer to his own position as enemy troops closed in. Outside, German soldiers were in the streets. Inside, they were entering the same building, moving up the stairs, clearing room by room. At some point, Fox gave his comrades the order they did not want to hear: fall back. The remaining Americans and Italian partisans slipped out of the village under cover of smoke and confusion, retreating to new defensive lines. Fox stayed. Someone had to keep eyes on the target. Someone had to keep the artillery firing. Someone had to buy them time. By now, the shells were landing almost on top of him. As the Germans pressed closer, Fox radioed for another adjustment, closer still. The artillery officer on the other end of the line warned him that the next salvo would land directly on his coordinates. Fox understood. If he fired, he would die. He also understood that the Germans were using his position as a focal point. Knock out that house and you kill the enemy spearhead. Fox's answer was simple. Fire. There is no recording of his exact words, only the memory of those on the other end of the line. Some later accounts say he told the Fire Direction Center, "Just fire it. There's more of them than there are of us." The formal Medal of Honor citation describes it more dryly. After being warned, he insisted that the last adjustment be fired, as this was the only way to defeat the attacking soldiers. The guns of the 598th Field Artillery Battalion obeyed. A full battery fired on Fox's coordinates. The shells took about 30 seconds to arrive. When they did, they ripped through stone walls, shattered German formations in the street, and annihilated the building Fox was in. Somewhere in that maelstrom, the forward observer who called the mission was killed. Down in the valley, retreating American forces heard the barrage and felt its shockwave. It wrecked the German timetable. It delayed their offensive, and it gave the 92nd the time they needed to pull back, reorganize, and later counterattack. When American and Italian forces re-entered Sommo-Colonia on January 1, 1945, they found Fox's body in the ruins of the house he had used as an observation post. Around him were the bodies of roughly 100 German soldiers. The fire mission had been exactly on target. It had done precisely what Fox intended, killed the attackers, wrecked their assault, and traded his single life for the lives of hundreds of evacuees and retreating troops. The artillery barrage Fox called lasted about 3 minutes. In that time, it killed an estimated 100 German soldiers in the streets around his observation post. For a village as small as Sommo-Colonia, that was a devastating blow. German reports later confirmed the high casualties and noted that the sudden, concentrated fire disrupted a planned attack on the main American defensive line. The 92nd Infantry Division, the only all-black infantry division to fight in Europe, carried its own heavy burden. Poorly supplied, often led by white officers who doubted their abilities and handed nearly impossible missions, its soldiers fought and died in a campaign that many Americans have forgotten. Fox's action in Sommo-Colonia stands out, not because it was the only act of courage in that division, but because it was the most brutally clear example of what their service cost. On January 22, 1944, a year before Fox's last stand, Company F of the 143rd Infantry Regiment tried to cross the Gari, often mistakenly called Rapido River, near San Angelo, Italy. The mission was to cross an ice-covered bridge under darkness and attack heavily prepared German positions on the far bank. The Germans had registered their artillery and mortars on every likely crossing point and wired the approaches with barbed entanglements and overlapping machine gun fire. McCall, then a staff sergeant, commanded the machine gun section assigned to support the riflemen. Under intense shelling, he led his men across the bridge, reorganized them under fire on the far side, and sighted his guns so they could cover the battalion front. Shells landed around them. One blast killed an assistant gunner, wounded the gunner, and wrecked one of the weapons. McCall crawled across open ground through machine gun and mortar fire, gave first aid, and dragged the wounded man to cover. Then another shell wounded the crew of the second gun, leaving McCall the only unwounded member of his section. He picked up the remaining machine gun, ran forward with it on his hip, and closed to within 30 yards of a German nest. He fired 2 bursts, killing or wounding the enemy crew and silencing the gun. A second German gun opened up on him. McCall rushed that position too, again firing from the hip and killing 4 members of that crew. A third gun, 50 yards behind the first 2, was pouring fire into American lines. McCall spotted it and advanced alone through overwhelming fire. He was last seen still moving forward, firing his gun from the hip as German bullets cracked around him. Then he disappeared into the chaos. McCall was not blown apart by his own artillery as Fox would be a year later. He was clubbed and captured by German infantry. American headquarters assumed he had been killed and recommended him for a posthumous Medal of Honor. Months later, they discovered he was alive in a POW camp, one of the very few men to be awarded the Medal of Honor posthumously, and then live to wear it. The dramatic 200 killed while dying under his own barrage line floating around the internet wraps Fox's artillery decision around McCall's name and amplifies the casualty figure. The real figure for Fox is closer to 100 Germans. The real story for McCall is a machine gunner who refused to stop advancing until he was physically stopped. If you are enjoying this story and want more untold accounts from World War II prisoners of war, make sure to subscribe to the channel. We are bringing you stories that most history books never covered. John Fox did not live to see his medal. For decades after the war, his action was known only in fragments, stories among veterans of the 92nd, remarks in after-action reports, a mention in regimental histories. Racial prejudice and bureaucratic neglect meant that no Medal of Honor was awarded to him in the immediate post-war years, despite the scale of his sacrifice. In the 1990s, a review of records for Black World War II veterans finally brought his case, and others like it, to the surface. On January 13, 1997, more than 50 years after he called fire on his own coordinates, Fox's widow received his Medal of Honor from President Bill Clinton in a White House ceremony. The citation explicitly states that his last fire mission killed approximately 100 German soldiers and delayed their advance long enough for U.S. forces to withdraw and reorganize. Thomas McCall's Medal of Honor was presented much earlier, on April 17, 1945. After the war, he continued his service, fought in Korea, and rose to Master Sergeant before retiring. In 1965, he drowned at age 49 while rescuing his 8-year-old son from a river. He died as he had lived at the Rapido, going toward danger so someone else might live. When the American guns finally fired the salvo that John Fox had demanded, the sound in the Italian hills changed. In the gun pits of the 598th Field Artillery, it was just another fire for effect order, one more set of coordinates in a long day of numbers and bearing corrections. For the soldiers still running through the alleys of Somocolonia, it felt like the entire village detonated at once. Fox had been walking the rounds in a few yards closer each time. That meant the gunners already had his position dialed in. The next concentration would land almost exactly on the stone house he was using as an observation post. When the shells arrived, they didn't drift. They slammed down in a tight pattern around that building and the streets feeding into it. German troops moving up the narrow lanes had no chance. The first blasts turned the house into a fragmentation bomb made of stone. Shattered masonry, roof tiles, beams, weapons, and bodies ripped through the formations massed outside. A platoon that had been advancing in good order was suddenly a pile of uniforms and twisted metal. Those not killed outright were deafened, stunned, or badly wounded. The attack did not stop the entire Wintergewitter offensive, but it broke the spear pointed directly at the 92nd Division's immediate line. Time that would have been spent rolling over disorganized black infantrymen down in the valley was instead spent clearing rubble, reorganizing units, and evacuating casualties. That delay was the difference between a rout and a fighting withdrawal. When American and Italian forces walked back into Somocolonia a few days later, they saw the result more clearly. The house where Fox had been was not simply damaged. It was opened like a broken dollhouse. Inside and around it lay roughly 100 German dead. The body of a single American lieutenant was somewhere among them. From a cold tactical standpoint, Fox had traded his one life for a company-sized slice of the enemy's combat power and bought his own battalion breathing space. From a human standpoint, he had climbed the ladder all the way to the top rung, choosing certain death to give his friends a chance. A year earlier, Thomas McCall did not have a telephone in his hand. He had a .30 caliber machine gun on his hip. The situation near the Gari River is less cinematic than Fox's house in Somocolonia, but just as desperate. The 36th Infantry Division had been ordered to cross the river and break through the German Gustav Line, one of the strongest defensive belts in Europe. The crossing sites were perfectly registered by German artillery. Minefields and barbed wire funneled the American assault into narrow lanes. Machine guns waited for them on the far bank. By the time McCall's section got across the ice-slicked bridge, the leading rifle companies were in pieces. Men were lying in the open, hit by mortar fragments or pinned by crossfire from multiple German nests. The attack was supposed to roll on like a wave. Instead, it was stalled on the wrong side of a freezing river, in full view of German observers. McCall's Medal of Honor citation stresses something easy to miss from a distance. He wasn't just pulling heroics with a gun, he was functioning as the nervous system of his part of the line. He reorganized fractured squads, placed his guns where they could anchor the defense, and created some semblance of a firing line out of chaos. When his crews were killed or wounded, he didn't fall back with the survivors. He picked up the empty weapon, moved closer to the enemy, and continued the mission alone. The second and third nests he silenced weren't random targets. They were key nodes pouring fire into the bridgehead. Every enemy gun he knocked out reduced the kill zone for the next wave of Americans coming across that river. Every minute he held their attention was a minute his own riflemen could dig shallow scrapes, pull wounded back, or, if ordered, slip back across to safety. The attack on the Gari ultimately failed. The 36th Division suffered terrible casualties and was driven back. On paper, that makes McCall's stand a footnote to a failed operation. But ask the survivors of Company F how they got off that far bank at all, and they will tell you about a staff sergeant standing up with a machine gun in his hands, drawing the fire so they could move. Fox saved a battalion by dying under his own artillery. McCall saved as much of his company as he could by refusing to leave the front lip of the fight until the enemy physically dragged him away. The most brutal thing about both stories is what happens or doesn't happen after the gunfire ends. When Fox called down the barrage that killed him, the Army wrote up an after-action report noting that a forward observer had been lost in Samacolonia and that his last fire mission had caused heavy enemy casualties. That report went into a file. The file went into an archive, and there it sat. In the late 1940s and 1950s, Medal of Honor recommendations for black soldiers were rare, and Fox's name never made it through the bureaucratic maze. His widow went on with her life having lost a husband, but without the nation ever saying formally, "We know what he did." For more than 50 years, the only people who truly understood the scale of his choice were the men who'd been allowed to escape that village. McCall's case was strange in a different way. When he vanished under German fire at the Rapido, everyone assumed he'd been killed. The recommendation for his Medal of Honor went up the chain on the belief that he had died in a last stand. By the time anyone realized he was alive in a POW camp, the process was already underway. He came home from captivity to find out that he had been, on paper, a dead hero, and that the country had already honored his memory. That kind of recognition is a double-edged sword. On one side, a Medal of Honor can feel like the only proof that someone's suffering had meaning. On the other, it can trap a man in a single moment of his life. McCall went back into uniform after World War II. He fought again in Korea. He rose to Master Sergeant, the rank of someone who lives in the middle of the system, training young soldiers, enforcing standards, making sure the small things get done right. Yet every time his name appeared in print, it came with the same 3 lines about the Gari River. He would always be the young man with the machine gun, even as he aged into the older man with the clipboard. Fox never had to live with that, but his family did. For his widow and relatives, the Medal of Honor ceremony in 1997 was not a triumphant unveiling of a hero. It was a public reopening of an old wound. The day a phone call ended and a husband did not come home. To get that recognition, they had to sit through speeches that retold in forensic detail the way he chose to die. Put the two situations side by side and the contrast is sharp. Fox's weapon is abstract. A map, a radio, and the ability to move destruction around a grid. He doesn't see the shell bursts up close. He sees their effects at a distance. When he orders the final concentration, he is choosing to turn his own coordinates into a mathematically defined kill zone. His courage lies in overriding every instinct for self-preservation in service of a plan. McCall's weapon is the opposite. Tactile, heavy, intimate. He feels the weight of the gun on his hip, the recoil in his shoulder, the heat of the barrel. He hears individual enemy gun crews screaming or going silent as his bursts find them. His courage lies in closing the distance, on foot, under direct fire, again and again. Fox's sacrifice is instantaneous once the shells arrive. One decision, a few seconds of awareness as the first rounds come in, then nothing. McCall's is extended. He has time to be afraid, time to reconsider, time to see each member of his section go down, and every time, he decides to keep going forward. What joins them is the core choice. I will stay where it is worst, so that someone else doesn't have to. That's the moral spine of your title. The specific mechanics, artillery versus machine gun, 100 dead Germans versus 200, are details that matter historically, but they don't change the shape of the sacrifice. Years after the war, survivors of both actions were asked the same kinds of questions. What do you remember? What did it feel like? Men from the 92nd who fought in and around Samokolonia remembered Fox's calm on the radio. Even as the situation deteriorated, his voice did not break. He didn't shout. He didn't babble. He gave corrections, left 50, add 100, like it was a training exercise. Only at the very end, when the Germans were in his building, did the tone change. Not panic, urgency. A man who knows he is out of time. Men from Company F of the 143rd talked about McCall not as a legend, but as a sergeant who always seemed to be moving toward the loudest noise. On the far bank of the Gari, they saw him hauling wounded men back with one hand and dragging a machine gun forward with the other, like he physically refused to be in a safe place while his squad was in danger. When he disappeared into the smoke toward that third German gun, no one expected to see him again. The fact that McCall came home surprised those who had written him off. The fact that Fox didn't shocked no one. They had heard his last fire mission and knew what it meant. But in both cases, the men who were there tended to say the same thing in interviews. He saved our lives. That's how they understood it. Not as an abstract Medal of Honor citation, but as a personal debt. If you are enjoying this story and want more untold accounts from World War II prisoners of war, make sure to subscribe to the channel. We are bringing you stories that most history books never covered. The end of both stories is quieter than the middle. After years of service, Thomas McCall died in 1965, trying to save his 8-year-old son from drowning in a river in Kansas. He got the boy out. The current took him. People who knew his World War II story were not surprised that his last act was, again, moving toward danger, so that someone smaller could live. John Fox's remains lay in a military cemetery in Florence. The village of Samokolonia has a plaque and a small monument in his honor. Every year, locals and visiting Americans gather there on the anniversary of his last stand. The speeches are short. The village is still small. There are no roaring crowds, no flyovers. Just a stone wall, some names, and the knowledge that on one cold morning in 1944, a man in that house chose to die so that strangers could live. For your viewer sitting on a couch 8 decades later, it is easy to let these stories wash past as just more war trivia. Names, dates, casualty figures. But if you stop and compress each story down to the one moment that mattered, they become something else. A man on a phone, staring at streets full of enemies saying fire. A man with a gun on his hip, everyone around him down, choosing to run toward the third machine gun instead of crawling away. That is what above and beyond the call of duty looks like in real life.